I never thought a single sentence could make my whole world feel like it was tilting under my feet. But that's exactly what happened on the night my wife looked at me with eyes I could no longer read, and said words I still wish I could unhear, words that made my heart slow down, like it was suddenly too heavy to keep beating at a normal pace. I remember standing in our small kitchen, still wearing my work boots, tired and dusty from another double shift. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, louder than usual, like it was counting down to something. The sun had just set, and the house was quiet in that way it gets when two people don't know how to talk anymore. I could hear her breathing. I could hear my own heart thumping in my chest. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." It felt like the whole evening held its breath. I didn't know then that this moment would change everything. My plans, my future, my marriage, and even the way I saw myself as a man. I didn't know that this moment would undo 4 years of saving, planning, sacrificing, dreaming together. I didn't know that the truth she carried would make every long shift, every missed night of sleep, every dollar tucked away for our dream home feel suddenly pointless. I didn't know that the woman I trusted most had kept something from me. Something big. Something life-shifting. And the painful part is, I didn't see it coming. Not even a little. If you asked me back then what I was expecting to hear, I might have said she was upset about work, or maybe she wanted to visit her mother, or maybe she was thinking about changing careers. Something normal. Something small. Something marriages can survive. But the truth she told me was not small. And after she told me, I realized something that still stings. You can love someone with your whole heart and still not know what they're hiding behind their smile. I can still feel that moment like it's happening right now. The cold kitchen floor under my boots. The smell of the stew she had cooked hours earlier but barely touched. The dim light from the small ceiling lamp. Her hands fidgeting with her wedding ring. The way she couldn't look at me directly. My wife was never like that. She always looked at me when she talked. She always held my gaze, even when we argued. She was steady, straightforward, honest. Or at least, that's what I believed. But that night, she looked like someone else. And it scared me. Before I could say anything, she stepped back, giving herself space. That's when I knew this wasn't something we could push aside until morning. This wasn't something a couple shrugs off. This wasn't one of those "we'll laugh about it later" stories. This was different. My chest tightened. My throat felt dry. I didn't understand, but I could feel something slipping out of my hands, something I didn't even know I was holding so tightly. She said my name so softly I almost didn't hear it, but the softness made it worse because it sounded like someone apologizing to a person they're about to hurt. And I remember thinking, please don't say what I think you're about to say. But she did. And when she spoke, everything I thought I knew about the last 4 years, the saving, the dreaming, the building, the sacrifices, the long nights, the shared smiles, shifted. It didn't fall apart all at once. It just changed shape, like a puzzle rearranging itself into a picture I never meant to make. That night was the beginning of everything unraveling. Not because she hated me, not because we were fighting, but because of something she had been carrying alone while I thought we were carrying life side by side. And this story, my story, starts right there, in that small kitchen, with a truth she waited too long to tell, and a dream we spent 4 years chasing that suddenly didn't look like a dream anymore. I guess to understand what that night meant, you need to understand who we were before everything broke open. Because we weren't some couple constantly at war. We weren't unhappy. We weren't strangers living in the same house. At least, I didn't think we were. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 now, but at the time all this happened, I had just turned 38. My wife, Elena, was 36. We met when we were both young and unsure of what life was supposed to look like. But somehow, we ended up building something steady, something calm and ordinary, the way real life usually is when you strip away the noise. We had been married 12 years. No kids. Not because we didn't want them. Life just had its own timing, and eventually we stopped pushing the issue. Maybe that was our first quiet heartbreak as a couple. The kind that doesn't break you apart, but leaves a little cold space inside you. A space you learn to live with. We lived in a small apartment in a modest neighborhood. The kind where everyone knows each other, but keeps to themselves. We both worked, me as a warehouse supervisor, her as a dental assistant. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. Just two people trying to build something comfortable. But we had a dream. A shared one. A simple one. A house of our own. We used to talk about it late at night, when the world was quiet and our bodies were tired from work. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining a place where we could finally say, "This is ours." A backyard where she wanted to grow tomatoes. A small porch where I could drink coffee on weekend mornings. A guest room for family visits. A kitchen with enough space for us to cook together without bumping into each other. It was the kind of dream that felt almost childish. But for people like us, it was everything. So we started saving. Nothing big at first. $20 here, $50 there. Sometimes $100 when overtime was good. We had a little notebook where we wrote down every deposit. It became our ritual. Every month, we sat at the dinner table, added the new number, and smiled at how the total was starting to look like something real. For 4 years, we put away every extra penny we could. We didn't take vacations. We didn't buy new clothes unless we had to. We skipped birthdays and anniversaries and promised each other we'd celebrate big once we were in that house. It wasn't always easy, but we were doing it together. And that togetherness made the sacrifices feel meaningful. I thought those 4 years were the strongest years of our marriage. I thought nothing could shake us because we were building something hand in hand. But I would later learn something painful. 2 people can be walking the same road and still be headed toward different destinations. And sometimes the person walking beside you isn't walking toward the dream you think they are. I didn't see the signs. Or maybe I didn't want to. Because looking back now, I can see moments, small ones, that should have made me pause. Like the way she seemed distracted some nights. Or how she brushed off conversations about the future. Or how she kept certain papers tucked away in her purse instead of leaving them on the table like she used to. But love makes you trust. And trust makes you blind. She was my wife. My partner. My best friend. So I didn't question anything. Not until the night everything changed. But before we get there, before the truth came out like cold water over a fire, I want to tell you more about how it all began. Because stories like this don't break in one moment. They crack slowly, like ice under weight you don't realize you're carrying. Our life was simple, predictable in the best way. We worked. We ate dinner together most nights. Weekends were for grocery shopping, laundry, and watching movies on the couch. Some nights she would paint. She loved watercolor landscapes. Other nights I played old blues records and pretended I knew how to relax. We weren't perfect, but we were steady. And I think that's why I never expected anything to go wrong. When life feels stable, you don't look for cracks. You don't search for shadows. You don't hold your breath waiting for impact. You just live. And for those 4 years of saving, I believed we were living toward the same dream. I believed we were united. I believed we were building something real. But life has a quiet way of holding secrets behind closed doors. And sometimes you don't notice the door is locked until it's too late. The truth is, I didn't know my wife was carrying something heavy. I didn't know she was struggling. I didn't know she was worried, or scared, or hiding anything. If I had known, maybe things would have been different. Maybe we could have talked. Maybe we could have fixed it before it grew into something that could hurt us both. But that's the thing about life. You don't know what you don't know. And I didn't know a thing. Not until that night. Not until she said she needed to talk. Not until I saw her hands trembling. Not until she told me the truth. A truth that would shake the foundation of everything we had spent 4 years building. A truth I wasn't ready for. A truth that still echoes in the quiet corners of my mind. I can still remember the way the words landed, slow and heavy, like stones falling into a pond. I wanted to reach out, to take her hands, to stop the shaking I saw in her body, but I felt frozen. I didn't know what to say, and every possible response felt wrong. My mind raced, trying to find some clue, some hint, some reason why this was happening now. For years. 4 years of saving, dreaming, planning, building a life together. And now it all felt fragile, like it could slip away in an instant. She told me she had made a choice months ago, one that I didn't know about. She said she didn't tell me because she thought she was protecting me, or maybe herself, but hearing it now, her words felt like a betrayal carved into my chest. I tried to make sense of it, tried to find a way to understand, but my heart and my mind were not aligned. I wanted to scream, to cry, to plead, but all I could do was listen. I remember asking her why. Why now? Why keep this from me for so long? And she said, quietly, almost ashamed, that she was afraid. Afraid of how I would react, afraid of what it would do to us, afraid that the dream we had built together would be ruined. Her eyes searched mine for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give, and in that moment, I realized something I hadn't admitted before. I wasn't sure if I even knew who she was anymore. The house we had imagined, the backyard with the small porch and the garden she wanted to plant, the kitchen where we would cook together, it all seemed distant now, as if it had been a mirage we both believed in. The 4 years of discipline, sacrifice, and planning suddenly felt like a shadow, a pretense of security that had never been real. I wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, I felt hollow, like I was standing in a room full of memories that no longer belonged to me. We sat there for hours, neither of us saying much. The night grew darker outside, and the quiet of the house pressed in on us. Sometimes, she would whisper something, and I would respond mechanically, nodding or murmuring, trying to keep the conversation going without knowing if it even made sense. I had loved her all these years, trusted her completely, and yet now, the foundation beneath us felt unstable. I realized that trust is not just about faith, it is also about knowing, about being aware of the weight someone carries. And I hadn't known. I hadn't seen the weight she carried alone. In the following days, I replayed every conversation, every decision, every small gesture, trying to find clues I could have noticed. I remembered the times she hesitated when I asked about the house, the nights she seemed distant when we discussed our plans, the little receipts she kept tucked away in her wallet. None of it made sense at the time, but now, in hindsight, the pieces began to fall into place. I realized that while I thought we were moving in sync, she had been navigating a different path altogether, one that diverged from the dream I thought we shared. I spent many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself if love was supposed to feel like this, like a puzzle missing pieces I never knew existed. I wondered if I had been blind, if I had failed to see her struggles, her fears, her secrets. I had always believed that love was enough, that being present, being supportive, being faithful, and working together would carry us through anything. But now, I understood that love is sometimes not enough if the other person is fighting battles alone. She tried to explain why she did what she did, her words soft and careful, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile thread that still connected us. She said she had hoped to resolve it before I ever found out, that she never wanted to hurt me, that she still loved me. And I believed her, part of me did. But belief doesn't erase pain. It doesn't remove the sting of realizing that someone you trusted completely has lived a part of life in silence, alone. It doesn't make the weeks, months, or years of hidden worry and tension vanish. All it does is leave you standing in the quiet, wondering if what you thought was real ever really was. For weeks after that night, the house felt different. Every corner, every room, every item we had placed with care now seemed like a silent witness to the truth we had discovered. I would walk past the kitchen and see her moving, busy with chores, and feel a pang of distance I couldn't cross. I would hear her humming softly while doing laundry and feel like an observer in her life rather than a participant. The 4 years of shared effort and sacrifice suddenly seemed fragile, like a glass ornament that could shatter at any moment. Our conversations changed too. They became cautious, measured, as if both of us were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I would ask her questions about our future, about the house, about everything we had planned, and she would answer carefully, choosing her words with precision. It was not deception, not exactly. It was protection, but it felt like a barrier between us. I realized that we had crossed an invisible line where trust, once absolute, now required negotiation, care, and careful attention. And in that realization, I felt a profound loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from being physically alone, but from the awareness that someone you love deeply is carrying a hidden weight you cannot reach. I thought about giving up, walking away, letting the dream go entirely. The thought scared me, but part of me wondered if that would be easier than trying to rebuild something that felt fractured. I imagined leaving the apartment, starting over, and creating a life free from the tension that now hung in the air. But then I remembered the life we had built together. The laughter, the quiet mornings, the shared dinners, the small moments that, in hindsight, mattered more than the big dreams. And I realized that leaving would not erase the love I still felt, nor would it erase the shared history that had become a part of me. So I stayed. I listened. I tried to understand. I tried to hold space for both of our fears, our regrets, our unspoken words. And slowly, In the quiet of those difficult weeks, I began to see a different side of her. The vulnerability she had been hiding, the courage it took to eventually speak, the hope that we could still rebuild despite everything. It was not easy. Some nights, tears would come unbidden, falling silently onto the pillow as I grappled with the mixture of hurt, confusion, and love that filled me. Other nights, I would sit beside her, holding her hand, feeling the warmth of her presence and wondering how two people could carry so much history and still find a way forward. The truth she had revealed changed everything. Yes, but it also opened a door to a deeper understanding. I began to see that relationships are not just about shared dreams, but also about navigating the unexpected, facing discomfort together, and learning to hold one another even when the path is unclear. I began to understand that love does not mean knowing everything. Sometimes it means accepting that there are parts of someone you may never fully understand, and still choosing to walk alongside them, to support them, and to hope. We didn't talk about the house much at first. Every mention felt like a sharp reminder of what had almost been lost. But gradually, as we adjusted to the new reality of our relationship, conversations became easier. We began to discuss our finances openly, to set new boundaries, to check in with each other about fears and concerns that had previously gone unspoken. It was painstaking work, but work that reminded me that love is active, not passive, that it requires effort, honesty, and courage every single day. And in those quiet, painstaking moments, I began to feel a subtle shift. The anger and hurt began to soften. The fear of betrayal began to give way to understanding. I realized that she had made mistakes, yes, but she had also shown immense courage in revealing the truth, entrusting me with her vulnerability after months of silence. And in that realization, I began to remember why I had loved her in the first place. The kindness in her eyes, the patience in her voice, the warmth of her presence that had carried me through countless ordinary days and made them extraordinary simply because she was there. I still don't know if we could have avoided the pain if the truth had come out sooner. Maybe we could have. Maybe the dream would have stayed intact. But I also understand now that pain and struggle are part of life, part of love, and part of building something real together. And while the house remained a symbol of our dream, it became something more, a reminder that love is about resilience, about facing challenges together, and about finding hope even when the path is unclear. In the weeks and months that followed, we took small steps toward rebuilding trust. We talked more openly, laughed more freely, and allowed ourselves to be honest in ways we hadn't been before. And though the memory of that night never fully faded, it became part of our story, a chapter that reminded us of our humanity, our imperfections, and our capacity to endure. The days after the revelation felt like walking through fog. I moved around the apartment, accomplishing tasks mechanically, as if my body had learned the motions while my mind remained trapped in a swirl of confusion and hurt. Elena would sit across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes tracing invisible patterns on the tablecloth, and I would watch her, torn between wanting to reach out and fearing I would break whatever fragile connection remained. We existed in the same space, but somehow we had become strangers inhabiting the same house. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Every word, every pause, every inflection. I searched for clues, for signs that could have warned me, that could have prepared me. But the truth is, there were none. She had been careful, meticulous, protecting both of us from a pain she clearly knew was coming. And yet, the protection itself had caused pain in a different form. I realized that sometimes, keeping a secret, even with the best intentions, can hurt more than any immediate honesty ever could. I began noticing the little things again, the subtle changes that I had ignored in the past. The way she would pause before answering questions about the house. The way her smile sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes. The way she carried herself as if burdened with an invisible weight. And suddenly, every small gesture, every whispered comment, every seemingly insignificant moment felt like part of a hidden puzzle I had never been invited to solve. I hated that I had been blind. I hated that I had trusted blindly. But more than that, I hated that I had allowed myself to be blindsided by someone I loved so completely. We tried to talk, of course. We sat together for hours on end some nights, attempting to untangle the web of emotions, trying to piece together a plan for moving forward. Some conversations ended in tears. Others ended in silence. The kind of silence that fills rooms with tension, that lingers in your chest long after words have failed. I realized then that love is not about avoiding these moments. It's about sitting in them, feeling them fully, and somehow finding a way to emerge on the other side. I felt anger creeping in at times. It wasn't the explosive, loud anger one sees in movies or reads about in books. It was quiet, simmering, and persistent. I was angry at her, yes, but also at myself, for not seeing, for not questioning, for assuming that trust alone could shield us from life's complexities. I was angry at the universe for placing us in a situation where love, loyalty, and sacrifice seemed insufficient. And yet, intertwined with the anger, there was an undeniable undercurrent of compassion. I remembered the woman I had married, the life we had built, and the reasons I had fallen in love. I understood that her silence was not born of malice but of fear, and that understanding brought its own kind of sorrow, a sorrow that weighed more heavily than any anger could. There were moments when I would catch her looking at me with a fragile smile, and my heart would ache. I wanted to comfort her, to reassure her that I still loved her, that we could survive this, that the dream we had shared was not lost. But I was hesitant. I feared that any gesture of affection could reopen wounds too raw to touch. I feared that my own vulnerability might collapse under the weight of our shared pain. And so, we navigated our days like this, close in proximity, but separated by walls built from hurt, fear, and uncertainty. Some nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how 4 years of planning, saving, and dreaming could be overshadowed by a single revelation. I wondered if this was the way life was meant to test us, by presenting a truth so disruptive that it forces you to question every assumption, every choice, every belief you have about the people you love and the life you are building. I realized that pain is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, creeping, subtle, a slow erosion of certainty until nothing feels solid beneath your feet. Despite everything, I tried to hold on to hope. I reminded myself that we were not the same people we had been 4 years ago. We were different now, changed by circumstance, by fear, by revelation. And perhaps that change, as painful as it was, could be a doorway to something deeper. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Because surrendering completely to despair would mean losing not just the dream of the house, but the dream of us, the dream of love that had carried me through so many ordinary days. Slowly, tentatively, we began to reintroduce small routines. We cooked together again, laughed quietly at minor mishaps, shared coffee on Sunday mornings without discussing the past or the future. These moments felt fragile, but they were enough to remind me that connection was still possible. That love, though tested, could still exist in forms quieter and subtler than I had imagined. I realized that survival in a relationship is not about grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. It is about consistency, patience, and a willingness to show up every day, even when the heart is bruised. I also began to notice changes in myself. I was more reflective, more cautious, and more aware of the unspoken undercurrents in our interactions. I learned to listen not just to words but to pauses, to gestures, to the spaces between sentences. I became more patient with her and, surprisingly, with myself. I understood that mistakes are part of being human, that no one navigates life perfectly, and that the path to reconciliation is rarely linear. Sometimes it is messy, winding, and slow, and that is okay. There were moments of doubt, of course. I questioned whether we could ever truly rebuild trust. I questioned whether the shared dream of the house still mattered if the foundation of honesty had been shaken. I questioned my own capacity to forgive and my own willingness to stay. But each time doubt arose, I reminded myself that love is not about certainty. It is about choice, the choice to remain, the choice to try, the choice to believe that two people can navigate the darkness together. I began to see Elena in new ways. The vulnerability she displayed, the courage it took to reveal the truth, the quiet strength in her daily actions. It all painted a portrait of a person trying to survive and protect, even when it meant hiding a part of herself. And in that portrait, I found compassion. I found understanding. I found the beginnings of forgiveness, not because the pain had disappeared, but because I recognized the humanity in both of us. Our journey forward was slow. There were setbacks, moments when old fears resurfaced, moments when the past seemed to loom too large. But gradually, we learned to navigate these moments together. We talked more openly about our feelings, our expectations, our worries. We celebrated small victories, a day without tension, a laugh shared, a quiet night without fear of the unspoken. These small victories became the building blocks of trust again, fragile but growing stronger with each passing day. And through all of it, the dream of the house remained. Not as a symbol of perfection or control, but as a reminder of what we had built together. The patience, the effort, the shared vision, the love that had carried us this far. I realized that the house itself was not the dream. It was the journey we took together, the lessons we learned, and the resilience we discovered within ourselves. In those early months after the revelation, I learned a profound truth about love. It is not static, not guaranteed, and not immune to human imperfection. It is fragile, yes, but it is also remarkably persistent. It survives not because it is untouched by pain, but because it endures in spite of it. And sometimes, surviving together, even through the slow, difficult days, is more meaningful than any perfect plan, any shared dream, or any material achievement. The weeks stretched into months, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of what had been revealed settle deeper into my chest. Life moved forward in a quiet, fragile rhythm, punctuated by small victories and subtle setbacks. Sometimes, the past would resurface unexpectedly. A phrase she had once said, a forgotten receipt, a glance that carried the memory of secrets, and I would feel the familiar pang of betrayal. But the more I watched her navigate the world with grace despite her fears, the more I understood the complexity of human choices. It wasn't just the revelation itself that had shaken me. It was the realization that someone I loved, someone I had trusted with everything, had been carrying burdens alone. She had shielded me, yes, but in doing so, she had carried a weight I had no idea existed. I began to reflect on all the ways we unknowingly hurt each other, the ways silence and unspoken fears can erode even the strongest foundations. I realized that relationships are rarely simple or clean. They are messy, full of compromise, and often require more courage than we can imagine. One evening, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at the floor, while she moved around the apartment, humming softly. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. I felt a mixture of longing, frustration, and tenderness all at once. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance that had grown between us, but I wasn't sure how. Words felt inadequate, gestures seemed insufficient, and the silence between us was heavy with history. Yet, in that moment, I realized that silence can also be a space for reflection, for understanding, and for the slow rebuilding of trust. I started paying attention to the little things again. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the table, the soft sighs she let out when she thought I wasn't watching. These small gestures became windows into her inner world, glimpses of vulnerability that I had long ignored. I realized that love is not just about shared dreams or plans for the future. It is about noticing the subtleties, understanding the fears, and offering support without judgment. There were nights when the weight of everything pressed down so heavily that I couldn't sleep. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the 4 years we had devoted to saving for our dream home. I thought about every sacrifice, every skipped outing, every dollar we had set aside, and I wondered if it had all been for nothing. Not because the dream itself was lost, but because the foundation of trust beneath it had been shaken. I felt a profound sadness, the kind that leaves you hollow yet reflective, a sadness that forces you to reconsider what truly matters. In those moments, I began to understand the complexity of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not instantaneous, and it does not erase pain. It is a process, a deliberate choice to acknowledge hurt, to accept human imperfection, and to continue moving forward despite it. I realized that forgiveness does not require forgetting, nor does it demand that everything return to the way it was. It simply requires a willingness to continue, to rebuild, and to seek understanding even when the path is uncertain. Elena and I began small rituals to reconnect. We would sit together in the evening, talking about our days, sharing stories from work, and occasionally laughing at things that seemed insignificant but felt important. I noticed her smile returning, subtle at first, then more frequent, like sunlight slowly breaking through clouds. And I realized that trust, once fractured, could be rebuilt, not in grand gestures, but in consistent, honest effort. Each conversation, each shared laugh, each quiet moment of companionship became a brick in the reconstruction of our relationship. Yet, there were still challenges. Moments of doubt would resurface when I least expected them. I would catch myself questioning her intentions or worrying that another secret might be lurking just out of sight. I recognized that these thoughts were part of the healing process, not signs of weakness or failure. And slowly, I learned to navigate these uncertainties with patience, compassion, and a commitment to understanding rather than judging. One afternoon, we walked through the neighborhood where we had first rented our apartment. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. We talked about mundane things, neighbors, small repairs, upcoming appointments. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the journey we were navigating together. It was during these walks that I realized the depth of resilience in both of us. We had endured disappointment, confronted difficult truths, and yet, we continued to move forward. The dream of the house remained, but it had transformed in my mind. It was no longer just a physical structure. It had become a symbol of endurance, of partnership, and of the capacity to withstand life's unexpected blows. As the months passed, I found moments of quiet reflection. I would sit alone in the early morning, drinking coffee on the balcony, thinking about how life can shift in an instant. One moment, you are secure, believing that everything is in place. The next, you are confronted with truth, vulnerability, and uncertainty. And in that confrontation, you either falter or grow. I chose to grow. I chose to understand. I chose to walk beside the woman I loved, acknowledging our past struggles while committing to a shared future. Elena's presence became both a comfort and a reminder. I learned to listen more attentively, to value transparency, and to accept that life is rarely predictable. We discovered that communication is not just about speaking, but also about observing, feeling, and responding to unspoken emotions. Slowly, our home began to feel like a place of refuge again, a space where honesty and empathy could coexist, where laughter could return, and where the foundation of our relationship, though tested, could be strengthened. Through this period, I also began to reflect on my own role in our journey. I recognized moments when I had been unaware, inattentive, or complacent. I understood that trust and intimacy require continuous effort, attention, and care. And while I could not change the past, I could choose how to move forward with empathy, patience, and dedication. These realizations were not easy. They demanded self-awareness, humility, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about myself and the life I had built alongside her. There were nights when the quiet of the apartment was almost unbearable. I would hear her breathing, faint and steady, and feel the simultaneous warmth and ache of connection. The dream of the house loomed in my mind, but I understood now that it was not the structure itself that mattered most. It was the effort, the love, and the resilience we brought to our shared life. That understanding became a source of comfort and hope, guiding me through the lingering uncertainty and helping me embrace the possibility of reconciliation and renewal. Slowly, the emotional walls that had grown between us began to crumble. We learned to speak with honesty and compassion, to express fears without judgment, and to share vulnerability without hesitation. We discovered that rebuilding trust is a continuous process, not a single event, and that patience and persistence are essential. And as we moved forward, I realized that love is not defined by perfection or uninterrupted harmony, but by the ability to endure, adapt, and nurture connection even in the face of pain and uncertainty. Through this long and quiet struggle, I understood a profound truth. Life does not always unfold as planned. Dreams may shift, and people may falter, but resilience, empathy, and the willingness to continue together can transform hardship into a deeper, more meaningful connection. And though the dream of the house remained, it had become secondary to the strength, understanding, and compassion that now defined our relationship. The months went on, and life settled into a rhythm that was at once familiar and completely new. We were together, but we were also learning how to exist side by side in a way that didn't take trust for granted. Every conversation, every small act of consideration felt significant. Every morning she would make coffee, and every evening we would share a meal, and in those small moments, I felt a quiet hope rising inside me. It wasn't the explosive, joyful hope of youth or romance, but a steady, enduring kind, the kind that survives disappointment and betrayal and still manages to keep moving forward. Still, there were moments when the past would return uninvited. I would see something in her eyes, hear a hesitation in her voice, or remember a detail that had been hidden, and the old ache would flare up again. I realized that healing is not linear. Some days, I would feel almost normal, almost like our old life, and other days, the weight of betrayal would descend, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. But I began to understand that these moments were part of the process. Pain, I realized, is not the enemy. It is the guide. It teaches you where trust is fragile, where understanding is needed, and where love must be more than just words. One evening, I came home to find her sitting quietly in the living room, the soft light from the lamp casting gentle shadows across her face. She looked up at me, and for the first time in months, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that wasn't clouded by fear. She smiled, a small, tentative smile, and I felt a lump in my throat. I realized in that moment how much I had missed her presence, not just her physical presence, but the unguarded, honest part of her that I had loved so deeply. It struck me that reconciliation is not a single act, but a series of moments like this, moments that slowly knit a fractured bond back together. The house we had saved for loomed in my mind constantly. For years of careful planning, careful saving, careful dreaming, it had been our anchor. And yet, I began to see it differently. It was no longer just a symbol of material achievement. It was a symbol of patience, of endurance, of the work it takes to maintain not just a dream, but a relationship. I realized that the dream itself mattered less than the people who were part of it, and that the foundation of a home is nothing compared to the foundation of trust, understanding, and resilience between two people. Elena and I began to have deeper conversations about the future, about our fears, about what had been lost, and what could still be rebuilt. It was not easy. Sometimes, old wounds would resurface, and we would argue quietly, voices low, words measured, each of us trying not to fracture the fragile connection we had rebuilt. But each conversation, even the difficult ones, felt like progress. I understood that growth is rarely comfortable. It requires vulnerability, courage, and the willingness to confront the parts of yourself and your partner that you may not want to see. I noticed changes in myself as well. I became more patient, more observant, more willing to listen without immediately responding. I realized that my own assumptions and complacency had contributed to the breakdown of trust. I recognized that love requires more than presence. It requires engagement, attentiveness, and empathy. And as I worked to understand her more deeply, I also began to understand myself. I learned that mistakes do not define us unless we allow them to, and that the willingness to rebuild is what ultimately matters. One rainy afternoon, we sat together by the window, watching drops of water race down the glass. The city outside was muted, gray, and quiet, and in that stillness, we shared memories of the past, both joyful and painful. I thought about the early days of our marriage, the shared dreams, the laughter, the ordinary moments that had meant so much. And I realized that despite the hurt, the betrayal, the fear, there was still a profound love between us, a love that had been tested, strained, and yet survived. It was in those quiet, reflective moments that I began to see the truth of our situation. Life does not guarantee that dreams will unfold exactly as planned. People will make mistakes, secrets will be kept, and unforeseen events will test the bonds we hold dear. But the measure of a relationship is not in its immunity to hardship, but in its ability to endure, adapt, and grow stronger through adversity. I understood that our love was not perfect, but it was real, and that reality carried more weight than any ideal I had once imagined. There were still challenges, of course. Moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the weight of what had been hidden seemed almost too much to bear. But we faced them together, gradually learning to trust not just each other, but the process of rebuilding itself. We discovered that patience is a form of love, and that consistent effort, even in small gestures, can restore faith and connection. Each day, each shared meal, each quiet conversation became a brick in the reconstruction of our bond, and with every brick, I felt hope returning. I also began to reflect on the deeper lessons this period had taught me. I realized that life's unexpected turns are inevitable, and that the way we respond to them defines not just the trajectory of our relationships, but our own personal growth. I learned that love is not about perfection, but about resilience. It is about showing up, even when it is hard. It is about choosing understanding over judgment, compassion over resentment, and connection over isolation. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that forgiveness is a conscious act, one that requires both courage and humility. Slowly, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. Laughter returned in small doses, quiet smiles became more frequent, and the tension that had hung over us for so long began to dissipate. We started planning again, not just for the house, but for life together. We discussed goals, hopes, and small steps we could take to strengthen our bond. The dream of the house remained, but it had taken on new meaning. It was no longer a distant goal measured in savings and construction plans. It was now a symbol of our resilience, our shared effort, and our ability to endure and rebuild together. In those months, I discovered a profound truth about relationships. The greatest challenges often reveal the deepest strengths. Pain, betrayal, and fear are not signs of failure. They are opportunities to grow, to understand, and to cultivate empathy. And as I observed Elena navigating her own emotions, confronting her fears, and slowly opening herself to honesty again, I realized that our shared journey through hardship had created a bond stronger than any dream, any plan, or any structure could ever represent. There were still nights when the memory of that revelation haunted me. I would lie awake, thinking about what had been hidden, wondering if we could have avoided it, imagining alternate paths where life had been simpler. But I learned to accept that the past could not be changed, only understood. And in that acceptance, I found peace. Not complete peace, but enough to continue, enough to rebuild, enough to love again with clarity, intention, and courage. Through it all, I realized that life is unpredictable, love is complex, and dreams may take unexpected forms. But even in the face of betrayal and uncertainty, there is hope. There is growth. There is the possibility of rebuilding stronger than before. And slowly, day by day, gesture by gesture, conversation by conversation, we began to reclaim not just the dream of the house, but the deeper, more meaningful dream of a life rebuilt on trust, understanding, and enduring love. The emotional weight of that night lingered longer than I could have imagined. Even as the days became calmer and routines returned, there was a subtle tension, an invisible thread stretched taut between us. I noticed it in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the quiet moments when our eyes met, and then quickly looked away. I noticed it in myself too, in the careful calculations of what I said, how I moved, how I showed affection. It was as if we were both walking on fragile ice, testing whether it would hold. There were mornings when I would wake before her, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, and watch the sunlight spill across the kitchen. I thought about the 4 years we had spent saving for our dream home, the sacrifices we had made, and the dreams we had stitched together in our minds. And yet, the dream felt distant now, less certain. Not because the house itself was unattainable, but because I had learned that a dream, no matter how carefully planned, can be vulnerable if the trust supporting it is shaken. Elena and I began talking more deeply about our fears, our regrets, and the things we hadn't dared to voice before. Some nights, we would sit for hours, revisiting memories both painful and joyful, peeling back the layers of our shared past in search of understanding. She would confess her own mistakes, the fears that had led her to keep secrets, and I would try to respond with patience and empathy. But it was hard. The hurt ran deep, and forgiveness is not instantaneous. It is cultivated slowly, moment by moment, through consistent actions and unwavering effort. One afternoon, as we walked through the local park, I felt a strange combination of melancholy and hope. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. We spoke about everyday things, neighbors, work, errands, but underneath it, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of our struggle. It struck me then that reconciliation is not a single grand act. It is a collection of small moments that gradually rebuild the foundation of trust and love. Every shared laugh, every gentle touch, every honest word was a brick in that reconstruction. There were times when I felt the old pain flare up, sharp and unexpected. A phrase she uttered, a lingering glance, or even a forgotten receipt could bring it rushing back, a reminder that healing is not linear. But I also noticed how she was trying, how she had opened herself to me in ways she hadn't before. And in that effort, I saw courage, the kind of courage it takes to face your own mistakes, to reveal your vulnerabilities, and to risk rejection in the hope of redemption. Slowly, the house we had dreamed of became more than just a physical goal. It transformed into a symbol of endurance, patience, and the shared work of rebuilding. Each dollar saved, each plan made, each conversation about renovations and rooms now carried a deeper meaning. The house was no longer merely a structure of brick and wood. It was a testament to our resilience, a reflection of the emotional labor we were investing in each other and in our relationship. Even as we moved forward, I noticed the subtle shifts in myself. I had become more reflective, more attentive, and more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. I realized that part of loving someone is accepting that they are human, imperfect, and sometimes flawed in ways that challenge your expectations. And part of loving someone is also recognizing your own flaws and taking responsibility for the ways you may have contributed to the strain in the relationship. There were evenings when we would sit together in silence, each of us lost in thought. And yet, even in silence, there was a quiet reassurance. The presence of another person, fully human, fully flawed, and still present, carries a kind of comfort words cannot always convey. I began to understand that intimacy is not always about conversation or action. It is about shared space, mutual recognition, and the willingness to continue walking together even when the path is uncertain. We learned to celebrate small victories. A day without arguments, a successful plan for dinner, a shared laugh over something trivial. These moments became milestones, markers of progress in our long, slow journey toward healing. And in celebrating these moments, I realized that growth is rarely about dramatic breakthroughs. It is about consistent, small efforts that accumulate over time, creating stability and strength in a foundation that had once been fragile. Despite the progress, there were moments when despair crept in. I would question whether the trust could ever be fully restored, whether the emotional distance we had endured had left permanent cracks. But each time doubt appeared, I reminded myself of the steps we were taking, the effort being made, and the love that had not disappeared even in the face of betrayal. I understood that love, like any living thing, requires care, attention, and patience to thrive, especially after it has been tested. I also reflected on the broader lessons of that period. Life does not offer guarantees. People will falter, circumstances will shift, and dreams may take unexpected forms. But in the midst of uncertainty, there is always the opportunity to choose resilience, empathy, and understanding. I realized that forgiveness is not a passive act. It is a conscious choice to acknowledge hurt, to process it, and to continue nurturing connection despite the scars. One evening, as we sat together watching the fading light outside, I felt a sense of calm I had not known for months. The pain of the past remained, but it had been tempered by understanding. The fear of betrayal still lingered, but it was balanced by the courage and effort she was showing to rebuild trust. And in that moment, I recognized that the heart of our journey was not the house we had dreamed of, but the love, patience, and resilience we were cultivating in our relationship. In time, I came to understand that life's challenges, no matter how painful, can also serve as teachers. They reveal our strengths, expose our weaknesses, and illuminate the paths we must take to grow and connect more deeply. And as Elena and I continued our slow, careful rebuilding, I felt a sense of hope, a quiet, enduring hope, that even in the wake of betrayal, love can survive, evolve, and deepen in ways we never expected. It became clear to me that the future was not defined by what had been hidden, but by the choices we made moving forward. The house remained a goal, a dream, a shared plan, but it was now intertwined with a greater purpose. The creation of a life grounded not merely in aspiration, but in understanding, empathy, and the commitment to walk together through whatever challenges lay ahead. And though the road was still long, and though there were moments when fear and doubt would resurface, I knew that this was the path we had chosen. A path of honesty, of effort, of connection. A path where love was measured not by perfection, but by the courage to endure, to forgive, and to rebuild. Even as we worked to rebuild, I began to notice subtle shifts in Elena's demeanor, shifts I had not seen before. There was a careful deliberation in her movements, a guarded quality to her expressions, and an almost imperceptible hesitation in her laughter. It wasn't that she didn't want to be herself, I realized, but that she was still carrying the weight of what had been left unspoken for so long. And I understood then that recovery is not only about rebuilding trust, but also about giving space for the other person to process their own mistakes and fears. I found myself reflecting more than ever on the nature of love and partnership. I had always believed that love was enough, that commitment and shared dreams could withstand any challenge. But the truth, I learned, is that love is not static. It is fragile, evolving, and requires constant care. It demands honesty, patience, and an ability to face uncomfortable truths without turning away. It demands forgiveness, not just of the other person, but of yourself for not seeing, for not questioning, for not recognizing the signs. The house we had been saving for had become almost secondary to the emotional work we were doing. It still existed in our conversations, still lingered in our dreams, but the real work was internal. It was in how we navigated mornings together without resentment, how we laughed again after moments of tension, how we approached difficult conversations with humility and care. It was in the small gestures that spoke louder than words, a hand held, a smile shared, a quiet acknowledgement of effort and courage. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I caught a glimpse of the fear she still carried. She confessed a lingering worry that I might leave, that the hurt she caused was too great to recover from. Her voice was low, trembling, not from malice, but from the raw vulnerability of someone who had exposed herself fully and feared rejection. I took her hands in mine, feeling the slight tremor, and I realized that love is not about erasing fear. It's about facing it together, holding each other even when uncertainty threatens to pull you apart. It struck me how much human beings can hide, even from those they love most. She had lived with a secret for years, a truth she thought might destroy everything, and in protecting me, she had also burdened herself. I thought about all the ways I had assumed, all the times I had taken comfort in routine, in shared plans, in the illusion of certainty. And I realized that trust requires more than faith. It requires attention, perception, and a willingness to engage with the complexities of the other person's inner life. We began talking more about our individual fears and hopes, about the parts of ourselves we had kept hidden, even from each other. These conversations were not easy. Some ended in silence, some in tears, some in quiet nods that spoke more than words could. But each conversation was a step forward, a piece of the fragile bridge we were rebuilding. And slowly, I began to feel a cautious optimism, a sense that perhaps we could emerge from this not only intact but stronger, with a deeper understanding of each other and of ourselves. There were moments, however, when the past threatened to pull us back. I would remember the exact moment she had told me the truth, the way my chest had felt like it was being squeezed, the disbelief and hurt that had followed. Those memories were sharp, and sometimes they made me question whether we could truly move beyond what had been revealed. Yet, each time the memory resurfaced, I reminded myself that healing is a process, not a single event. It requires patience, persistence, and the conscious choice to focus on rebuilding rather than reliving pain. I also began to see the strength in her efforts. Every time she chose honesty, every time she engaged in difficult conversations, every time she acknowledged her mistakes, I recognized courage. I understood that forgiveness is not a simple act of forgetting. It is an ongoing practice of empathy and understanding, a deliberate choice to value connection over resentment. And in recognizing her courage, I found my own capacity to forgive, to adapt, and to continue investing in the shared life we were committed to rebuilding. One quiet Sunday afternoon, we walked through the local market together. The world around us moved at its usual pace, unaware of the small victories and struggles that defined our life. We bought bread, picked out fresh fruit, and shared small smiles over trivial observations. It was ordinary, mundane even, yet in that ordinariness, there was profound meaning. We were learning to navigate life together again, not as the same people who had begun this journey 4 years ago, but as partners tempered by experience, aware of fragility, and committed to resilience. I realized that love is not measured by uninterrupted happiness, by perfect plans, or by shared material goals. It is measured by endurance, by the willingness to face discomfort, by the capacity to accept imperfection while still choosing to remain. And in that realization, I began to see our dream home in a new light, not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol of the emotional architecture we were rebuilding together. Trust, honesty, patience, and mutual respect forming the foundation upon which our future could rest. Despite the progress, there were still days when I felt the sting of the past. A hesitant glance, a misremembered conversation, or an unresolved doubt could bring it rushing back. But each time, I reminded myself that healing is layered, that progress is uneven, and that resilience is found in the persistence of daily effort. Love, I realized, is not static. It is cultivated in small, consistent actions that demonstrate care, attention, and commitment. Through all of this, I came to understand the complexity of human relationships in a way I never had before. People carry fears, regrets, and secrets that may remain hidden for years. And yet, the ability to confront those fears, to reveal vulnerabilities, and to engage in honest, deliberate effort is what allows connection to endure. I began to see not only the depth of her courage, but also the depth of my own capacity to love, forgive, and rebuild. As months passed, our home, both the physical space and the shared life within it, began to feel whole again. Laughter returned in small doses, our routines regained warmth, and trust, though tempered by experience, began to solidify. And through it all, I realized that the most meaningful dreams are not always the ones we envision in detail. Sometimes, they are the ones we rebuild together, moment by moment, brick by brick, choice by choice. It was during a quiet evening that the reality of everything hit me fully, all at once. I had been carrying a tentative hope for months, believing that we were slowly rebuilding what had been broken. And yet, as I sat across from her at the kitchen table, watching her sip her tea, I realized that some wounds, even when acknowledged and worked on, have a way of resurfacing. They linger, subtle but persistent, like echoes of a storm long past. I noticed the tension in her hands, how they gripped the cup tightly, and then relaxed just enough for me to see the tremor beneath. I saw it in the way she avoided meeting my gaze fully, as if she feared that any direct connection would expose the fragility we both felt. And in that moment, I understood that the work of reconciliation is never complete. It is ongoing, relentless, and sometimes more challenging than the initial shock of betrayal. I felt a mix of emotions, love, frustration, fear, and admiration, all jumbled together. I was proud of her courage, of her willingness to finally be honest after carrying a secret for so long. But I was also painfully aware of the distance that still remained between us. It wasn't a physical distance, but an emotional one, a gap formed by months of hidden truths and unspoken fears. I wanted to close that gap, to reach across and restore the intimacy we had lost, but I wasn't sure how. The house we had dreamed about, the plans we had meticulously laid out, suddenly seemed less important than the fragile human connection in front of me. I realized that a home is not built merely with walls, roofs, and floors. It is built with trust, communication, and shared vulnerability. And while we had spent years saving for the physical dream, the emotional foundation had been shaken, and it required far more than money or time to rebuild. Over the next few days, the tension grew more pronounced. We moved around each other cautiously, each step deliberate, each word measured. Even simple conversations carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. I realized that while time can heal, it cannot erase the memory of betrayal entirely. It can soften it, contextualize it, and allow for understanding, but the imprint remains. And yet, It was precisely this awareness that compelled me to approach her with patience, empathy, and renewed commitment. I began observing the small ways she tried to connect, offering a smile, initiating a conversation, touching my arm briefly. Each gesture felt like a fragile bridge, and I found myself crossing it carefully, responding with equal care. I understood that rebuilding trust is not about grand gestures. It is about consistency, sincerity, and attentiveness in the small, everyday moments. Each interaction became an opportunity to reinforce our bond, to show that we were willing to move forward despite past pain. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on the journey we had endured. I thought about the sacrifices, the arguments, the tears, and the quiet moments of hope that had carried us through. I realized that relationships are not defined by the absence of difficulty, but by the courage to face it together. And in this reflection, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, to continue nurturing our connection, to confront challenges honestly, and to ensure that our shared dream, both of a home and a life together, was grounded in truth and mutual respect. Then came a moment that changed everything. I discovered something I had not anticipated, an unexpected consequence of her secret, something that made me see the depth of her struggle in a new light. It was not malicious or intentional. It was a reflection of human complexity, of the ways people try to protect themselves and those they love. And as I confronted it, as I processed the implications, I felt a mixture of shock, sorrow, and empathy. It was a turning point, a moment where the past and present collided, forcing me to reassess everything I thought I knew about our life and our relationship. I remember standing in the living room, the evening light fading outside, feeling a profound stillness. I looked at her, and in that silent exchange, I sensed her fear, her regret, and her hope all at once. I realized that love is not linear, not predictable, and not always comfortable. It is messy, challenging, and sometimes painful. And yet, it is in this messiness that the depth of connection is revealed, the true resilience of a relationship tested, and the strength of commitment demonstrated. We spent the next hours talking, unraveling the new revelation, and confronting its impact on both of us. Emotions ran high, but there was no shouting, no blame. Just honesty, vulnerability, and the raw effort to understand each other fully. I realized that the turning point was not in discovering the secret itself, but in how we chose to respond, together, patiently, and with intentional care. Through that night, I understood a profound truth. The strength of love is measured not by how we handle good times, but by how we navigate the unexpected, the uncomfortable, and the painful. It is not in perfection that relationships thrive, but in resilience, empathy, and the willingness to confront reality head-on while holding space for each other's humanity. And as we finally sat in quiet, the weight of the evening slowly lifting, I felt a renewed sense of hope. We were not the same people we had been before the revelation, and our relationship had been irrevocably altered. But in that alteration, there was also growth, a deeper understanding, and a clearer vision of what it meant to truly share a life with someone, to forgive, to endure, and to rebuild stronger than before. The days that followed were heavy with reflection. Even as we continued our routines, the weight of everything lingered. I found myself pausing more often, thinking about how fragile trust can be, how easily it can be fractured, and how difficult it is to restore. I realized that healing is not just about moving past the event, but about confronting the lingering shadows it casts on every interaction, every thought, every decision. I began noticing my own responses more deeply. The tension in my shoulders, the way my chest tightened when I anticipated a conversation, the subtle hesitations in my voice. I realized that the emotional residue of betrayal doesn't vanish overnight. It seeps into the smallest corners of your life. And yet, acknowledging it allowed me to address it. I could no longer ignore my feelings or bury my doubts, because pretending they didn't exist would only delay the work that needed to be done. Elena was doing the same, in her own quiet way. She seemed smaller at times, burdened by the realization that her secret had caused ripples far beyond what she intended. Her eyes would cloud over with regret, and I would see her fighting with herself, trying to reconcile guilt and hope. And in those moments, I felt both compassion and sorrow. I understood that carrying a secret for years is not easy, that the weight of it can shape behavior, silence expression, and even distort the way someone engages with the world. We had conversations that stretched long into the night, sometimes ending with no resolution at all, just the quiet presence of each other and the willingness to keep talking tomorrow. It was exhausting, emotionally and mentally, but I recognized the necessity of it. Healing requires attention, patience, and the courage to endure discomfort without retreating. We were learning that lesson slowly, painfully, but with determination. Some days, I would catch glimpses of the life we once had, the easy laughter, the shared plans, the comfortable familiarity, and I would ache for that simplicity. And yet, I knew we could not go back. We could only move forward, with the lessons of the past etched into every choice we made. I began to understand that the strength of a relationship lies not in avoiding pain, but in confronting it together and choosing connection despite it. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed. I questioned whether the cracks in our trust would ever truly mend, whether the emotional residue of hidden truths would continue to shape our interactions indefinitely. But then I would notice the small gestures, a hand brushing mine across the table, a glance filled with apology and hope, a quiet effort to maintain connection even when it was difficult. These moments reminded me that progress is measured not in dramatic resolutions, but in tiny, deliberate acts of care. The dream of our house still lingered, but its significance had changed. It was no longer just a symbol of our planning and effort. It was now a reminder of resilience, of shared struggle, and of the work required to maintain both a home and a relationship. I understood that what we were building was not only physical, but emotional. Each decision, each conversation, each act of honesty and patience was contributing to the structure that would ultimately hold us together. Then came a day that shook me in a way I had not anticipated. A small, seemingly inconsequential event triggered a wave of old feelings, the sting of betrayal, the hurt, the anger, and the sorrow. I realized how deeply trauma can linger, how memory can resurrect old pain even when you believe it has faded. And yet, this moment also became a turning point. It forced me to confront my emotions fully, to communicate openly with Elena, and to finally acknowledge the depth of my own fears and vulnerabilities. We talked for hours that day. The conversation was raw and honest, filled with pauses, tears, and moments of quiet reflection. I listened to her fears, her regrets, her hope for a future we could still build. And I spoke my own truths, the doubts, the anger, the sorrow, and the longing to reconnect fully. By the end of the day, we were emotionally exhausted, yet something had shifted. There was a clarity, a renewed sense of mutual understanding, and the beginnings of a deeper bond forged in honesty. In those hours, I realized that love is not about perfection. It is not about avoiding mistakes or living without fear. Love is about endurance, courage, and the willingness to confront difficult truths together. It is about showing up, even when the heart is heavy, even when trust has been tested, even when the future feels uncertain. And in that realization, I felt a quiet resolve settle within me, a determination to keep moving forward, to keep nurturing our connection, and to rebuild not only the dream of a house, but the dream of a life shared fully and honestly. We began to see glimpses of light breaking through the emotional storm, a shared smile, a laugh at an old joke, a gentle acknowledgement of progress. These moments were small, but they were powerful. They reminded us that resilience is built in fragments, that trust can be restored through consistent effort, and that love, even after betrayal, can grow stronger when nurtured with patience, empathy, and courage. And so, we continued, day by day, conversation by conversation, gesture by gesture. The journey was far from over, but each step brought us closer to the understanding that life's challenges, no matter how painful, can also be opportunities to grow, to learn, and to love more deeply than before. In the quiet aftermath of revelation, I began to see not just the pain, but the potential for renewal, for connection, and for a love that, though tested, was still capable of enduring. The weeks that followed felt like navigating a delicate balance between hope and fear. Each day brought small victories, a shared meal without tension, a quiet laugh over something trivial, a lingering glance that hinted at reconnection. But each day also reminded me of the fragility of what we were rebuilding. Trust, once fractured, does not return fully intact. It is tentative, cautious, and must be nurtured carefully, like a fragile sapling growing through harsh soil. I became acutely aware of my own reactions, how easily a misplaced word could trigger old doubts, how quickly my mind would replay memories of the revelation. And I understood that healing is as much about managing your own emotions as it is about understanding someone else's. I had to be patient with myself, just as I had to be patient with her. Each of us was learning, relearning, the unspoken language of love and trust. Elena, too, was making her own efforts. I noticed the subtle ways she reached out, the tentative touches, the careful honesty in her words. She was still guarded at times, but the walls had begun to crumble, slowly and unevenly. I recognized that courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, almost invisible, yet its effects are profound. Every small act of openness from her was a bridge toward healing, and I realized that my willingness to meet her halfway was equally crucial. Then came an evening that changed the rhythm of our lives in a subtle but undeniable way. We were sitting together, working on some home plans, discussing paint colors and furniture arrangements, when she hesitated, her hand hovering over a piece of paper. There was a tension in the room I hadn't felt for months, a familiar unease, a reminder of the fragile ground we were treading. And then, softly, she spoke, revealing a detail I had not expected, a consequence of the secret she had carried all those years. The revelation wasn't malicious, but it was significant. It cast a shadow over the progress we had made, forcing me to confront not only her actions but the deeper implications for our shared life. I felt a rush of emotions, shock, sorrow, a pang of betrayal, and yet also compassion for the fear and burden she had carried alone. It was a moment that demanded both honesty and empathy, a delicate navigation of raw, unfiltered feelings. We spent hours talking that night. There was no shouting, no blame, only the painstaking work of unpacking the emotional weight of the new revelation. I listened to her fears, her regrets, and her hope that we could still move forward. I expressed my own feelings, the disappointment, the worry, and the longing for connection that had never fully left me. By the end of the conversation, we were exhausted but grounded, with a sense of clarity that had been absent for months. I realized then that love is tested most profoundly not in the absence of hardship, but in the presence of it. It is not the moments of ease that define the strength of a relationship, but the way two people face uncertainty, fear, and hurt together. And in that realization, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but I also knew that our commitment to each other, our patience, empathy, and honesty could guide us through. The days after that night were quiet but purposeful. We navigated our routines with renewed care, speaking more openly, observing each other's reactions, and responding with attention and kindness. I noticed how each small act, making coffee, offering a smile, asking about her day, was a building block in the reconstruction of our trust. And I understood that restoration is rarely dramatic. It is built slowly, with persistence, consistency, and quiet intention. I also reflected on the lessons this period had taught me about myself. I had learned patience, humility, and the importance of active engagement in a relationship. I had learned that love requires not only giving but also receiving, not only trust but also discernment, not only presence but also intentionality. And perhaps most importantly, I had learned that forgiveness is not a single act but a continuous choice, one that must be reaffirmed daily through action, attention, and care. Elena and I began to see glimpses of the life we had hoped to reclaim, moments of ease, laughter that felt natural again, quiet comfort and shared space. These moments were small, yet they carried immense significance. They were proof that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that love, even after betrayal and hardship, could endure. And through it all, the dream of our house remained, not just as a physical goal, but as a symbol of the emotional foundation we were constructing together. It represented more than savings and plans. It represented patience, resilience, and the ongoing effort required to maintain a relationship that had been tested to its limits. I realized that the real home was not the structure we were building, but the bond we were cultivating, moment by moment, choice by choice, day by day. The months that followed were quieter, yet heavier in a way that carried both tension and subtle healing. I began noticing the small shifts in our relationship, the way she would meet my gaze without hesitation, the softness in her voice when she spoke, the patience she now showed in our conversations. It wasn't perfection, but it was real. It was progress, and in that progress, I found hope. I realized that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. Pain resurfaces, challenges arrive unannounced, and the consequences of past mistakes can linger far longer than we expect. Yet, it is in how we respond that we define the trajectory of our relationships. I chose to respond with patience, empathy, and a commitment to rebuilding what had been broken. And slowly, day by day, gesture by gesture, trust began to resurface, fragile but growing stronger. Elena and I developed a rhythm of listening, sharing, and forgiving. Some days were harder than others. A casual word could trigger an old fear, a lingering memory could stir doubt. But each challenge became an opportunity to practice understanding, to communicate more clearly, and to strengthen the emotional bond we had nearly lost. I realized that the path to healing is rarely smooth, yet every small step forward is a victory in itself. I also noticed the ways in which I had changed. I was more reflective, more cautious, yet more willing to engage with the complexities of our life. I had learned that love is not only about affection or shared dreams. It is about vigilance, effort, and courage. It is about accepting imperfection, acknowledging mistakes, and consistently choosing connection over distance. And as I practiced these lessons, I began to feel a sense of resilience growing within me, a quiet strength that allowed me to face both the past and the future with clarity. There were evenings when we would sit together in silence, not because of distance, but because words weren't necessary. The shared presence, the quiet acknowledgement of each other's efforts, and the small signs of reconnection spoke volumes. I realized that intimacy is not only found in grand gestures or declarations. It is found in these quiet moments of mutual recognition, in the ability to coexist fully and honestly with someone who has shared both joy and pain with you. I thought often about the house we had saved for, about the plans we had made over 4 years. And I understood now that it was never just about a physical space. The house had become a metaphor for everything we had endured, the work we had invested in our life, and the emotional foundation we were rebuilding together. Every choice we made, every act of honesty, every small step toward trust was part of the architecture of our shared future. One afternoon, as we walked through the neighborhood, I caught a glimpse of her smile, genuine, unguarded, and full of warmth. It struck me how far we had come. The fear that had once hung heavily between us had begun to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. I realized that love is resilient, not in the absence of difficulty, but in the willingness to face it together. And I understood that our relationship, though tested, had the capacity to endure more than either of us had imagined. Even in moments of clarity, I recognized that challenges would still arise. Life does not erase hardship simply because time passes. But I also recognized that we had grown in ways that made us stronger. We had learned to communicate openly, to acknowledge vulnerability, and to offer empathy in place of judgment. And in this growth, I found a profound sense of peace, a quiet confidence that, together, we could navigate whatever uncertainty remained. I began to see love not as a static feeling, but as a living practice. It is nurtured through attention, kindness, patience, and courage. It is reinforced through understanding, honesty, and the deliberate choice to stay connected even when it is difficult. And as I embraced this understanding, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just in preserving our relationship, but in actively cultivating it, brick by brick, day by day. Slowly, the house we had dreamed of became a symbol of endurance rather than a simple goal. It reminded me that dreams are meaningful not just because of their realization, but because of the effort, patience, and resilience invested in achieving them. And I realized that the true dream was not the structure itself, but the life we were building together, the shared love, understanding, and commitment that would sustain us long after the walls were built. Through this ongoing journey, I learned the quiet, enduring power of forgiveness. I learned that healing is gradual, that trust can be rebuilt, and that love, even after betrayal, can grow stronger when nurtured with care and honesty. And as Elena and I continued to navigate this path together, I felt a profound gratitude, not only for the progress we had made, but for the deeper understanding of what it truly means to love and be loved. Time moved on, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and yet, in its passage, I noticed the subtle transformation in our life. The tension that had once hung heavily between us had softened, replaced by a calm understanding, a gentle patience, and a quiet appreciation for the journey we had endured together. We had survived the storm, not unscathed, but with a stronger, more resilient connection. I often found myself reflecting on the lessons we had learned. I realized that life rarely unfolds according to plan. Dreams can shift, secrets can surface, and challenges can arise that test everything we hold dear. But it is not the challenges themselves that define us. It is how we respond, how we nurture connection, and how we choose to move forward together that shapes the life we share. Elena and I had rebuilt more than just trust. We had rebuilt empathy, compassion, and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. The small, quiet moments became the foundation of our renewed bond. Sharing coffee in the mornings, laughing at old memories, listening to each other without interruption, and acknowledging fears without judgment. These gestures, simple as they seemed, carried immense significance because they represented consistency, care, and the deliberate effort to remain connected. The dream of our house, once a distant goal, had transformed in meaning. It was no longer simply a place to live. It had become a symbol of our shared resilience, of the work required to sustain love, and of the understanding that life's most meaningful achievements are measured not by possessions, but by the depth of connection we cultivate. Every plan, every decision, every brick laid in that dream was infused with a new awareness of what truly matters: trust, honesty, and enduring commitment. Even the painful memories had gained a new perspective. I could look back at the moments of betrayal and fear, not with bitterness, but with understanding. They had taught me to listen more deeply, to communicate more openly, and to approach relationships with patience and empathy. I realized that pain, while difficult, carries wisdom. It forces us to confront ourselves, to recognize our limitations, and to cultivate the resilience necessary for meaningful connection. There were still quiet moments of reflection when I would sit alone and consider how far we had come. I thought about the countless conversations, the long nights of uncertainty, the tears and laughter, the moments of fear and hope. And I understood that the true measure of love is not in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to face it together, the willingness to forgive, and the commitment to grow even when it is difficult. Elena and I often walk together in the evenings now, side by side, sharing our thoughts and dreams for the future. There was a sense of peace in these walks, a recognition that while the past could not be erased, the future was ours to shape. Every step forward was a testament to resilience, to the power of honesty, and to the beauty of rebuilding something stronger than we had before. I realized that life is unpredictable. People will falter, secrets may be kept, and dreams may take unexpected forms. But love, when nurtured with care, patience, and empathy, can endure beyond mistakes and uncertainty. It can grow stronger, deeper, and more meaningful when we approach it not with expectation, but with deliberate attention and understanding. And so, as I look back on the 4 years of saving, the revelation that shook our world, and the months of rebuilding that followed, I understand this. The greatest dream is not a house, a plan, or a goal. The greatest dream is a life shared fully and honestly with someone you love, a life where trust is nurtured, where vulnerability is met with compassion, and where connection is chosen every single day. I am grateful for her courage, for my own growth, for the lessons we endured, and for the love that survived despite everything. And in that gratitude, I find a quiet peace, a calm joy, and a deep understanding that the true foundation of any life worth living is not in what we acquire, but in the hearts we hold close, the truths we honor, and the enduring bonds we choose to protect. We had rebuilt, not perfectly, but with intention. And in that deliberate rebuilding, I found the truest sense of home. Not the house we dreamed of, but the life we created together, strong, resilient, and full of quiet, heartfelt love.